Hello and welcome to the Geek Pantheon. I am Eric, and today I have a very special treat for all of you. I am joined by Ajit George, the lead designer of Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, the next big book from Wizards of the Coast coming out. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Eric. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me on.
I'm very excited to have you on because honestly, when the initial video announcement dropped for this book and hearing you speak about it, it's very clear that you have a lot of passion behind this book and a strong drive to see it come to fruition. And I guess I wanted to jump off with something that you mentioned in that initial video and has kind of been in most of the talking points I've seen about the book, is this concept of hopepunk and solarpunk being genres that I personally had not had a whole lot of exposure to up until my exposure to this book. And so I noticed something on your Twitter where you specifically said that the book is hopepunk and the Citadel itself is solarpunk. And so if you could just speak to those genres and kind of the distinction between them and what you meant by that tweet, that would be great.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I want to preface it and say this is just my interpretation of both of the genres. Both genres are relatively new genres. And I'm sure other artists and writers will have different takes on it. I think of the two terms are very interrelated for sure. But I think of the Citadel, the Radiant Citadel, as solarpunk in that, solarpunk has an emphasis on a harmony or a balance and a deep interaction between a community and the surrounding environment or environment in general. And that solarpunk is, as I think of it, or as I've read it, and I've looked at artwork, and actually art more than anything else has influenced my thinking around solarpunk. And if you Google, for instance, the term solarpunk fantasy, you're going to see some incredible images, and I use some of those images to kind of inform my own work or my own thinking around the Radiant Citadel. But I think of it as a community that has come to some solutions to some of the existential problems they're facing. They have found a way to live with each other as peoples that have maybe had conflict in the past, maybe continue to have struggles and challenges, but maybe some of the existential challenges are gone, and they're kind of dealing with more day-to-day life challenges and continuing to find ways to ensure this community, this city, remains strong, remains vibrant, and continues to exist. And part of that solution is in an interaction with the environment, with an interaction with their surroundings, and a respect for the environment. For the Radiant Citadel, for instance, for many reasons, and this probably makes sense, it's primarily vegetarian. And that is not a political statement by me. I am an omnivore. I try to eat less meat. I'm a little conscious about that. But Radiant Citadel is in the middle of the deep ethereal plane, and so I thought about this city very logically. Like it's a fantasy city, but also all the pieces have to make sense to me. And I contrast that with one of my most beloved cities in D&D, which is Sigil. And Sigil's amazing city, very, very interesting, great lore around it. But I sometimes think if you look too closely, lots of the logic falls apart. It's very much a surrealist fantasy. Like it can only work in a really surrealist kind of setting. The Radiant Citadel is different in that regard because I was like, how does all of this work? Like, how do these pieces work? And some of it's just magic, but other parts of it are, hey, if the city's in the deep ethereal plane and all goods are transported through these Concord jewels, and these Concord jewels have to travel, they move pretty quickly, but there's still travel time. They have to negotiate costs with, the local communities they get, certain amounts of food from. Animal goods are going to be very expensive. If there's a rarity of it, then they'll be even more expensive. And I think as we face inflation in the United States, and I think global inflation, and we think about challenges of shipping, these are very actually timely conversations to have and thoughtful conversations to have. So it's a vegetarian society. Another one is that the Radiant Citadel recycles. And that's, once again, because of goods and the need to kind of be very thoughtful and mindful. So the Radiant Citadel is solar punk in that regard, in that it has found some level of harmony. It is working together. The communities have solved some of the problems, and they're going forward positively, though they still struggle. And there are still struggles, there are still challenges, but this conscious effort is in collaboration with each other. Hopepunk, I think, it came out as directly oppositional to Grimdark. And when we think of the term punk, it is an act of rebellion, right? It is an act of fighting it back, or saying, I don't agree with this, and I want to challenge this, right? So Hopepunk is the ultimate challenge to Grimdark. It is the rebellion against Grimdark. It says, sure, the world is terrible, or there are terrible things here, but rather than embrace the darkness, and I think Grimdark is all about embracing the darkness, and the strongest will survive, and gotta go darker to beat the darkness, or something like that, right? Kind of like that Batman kind of feeling, right? I will be the darkness to fight the darkness, right? Yeah. And Hopepunk is sort of the opposite of that, and saying, hey, the darkness is there, but there are other ways forward to battle the darkness, and collaboration and community. And just a hope for a better tomorrow is part of that way that we will not only survive, but that we will thrive. And when I say, I think the Radiant Citadel is solar punk, but the entire book, not only the individual locations, but the book is an act of hope punk. That is what I mean, in that some of these adventures do go pretty dark, and they face some pretty grim opponents. One of them goes to the Far Realm. It is the first time I think an adventure in 5e takes players to the Far Realm. So in that way, this book is very unique. For many reasons, this book is very unique. So it is not that everything here is rainbows and candy canes. It is that the book itself is an act of rebellion and an act of love. We do things with it that you haven't seen in D&D before. We say that most of the locations and most of the adventures talk about community as a solution to problems, not a bad thing. Sometimes people the only way through, and Grimdark is often about this, is the only way to rise to the top is to be a rugged individual, and it is just me against all the darkness. And this book is that kind of oppositional to that, and says, actually, no, we all working together is going to overcome the darkness. And I think that's, a lot of players may not understand that, but I actually think that's so D&D in its truest form, because the party is a community, right? A party is a group of people, not the individual. So that's what I mean by how I think the Radiant Citadel itself is solar punk, and the book is an act of joy, of hope punk. It is the fight against the darkness, but through embracing some positive ideals rather than going darker to fight the darkness.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, this kind of slides into one of the questions I had for you, where oftentimes we look at settings like cyberpunk or grimdark, that the world has taken a darker turn, and the adventurers or the heroes start with a major lack of resources or support, or like that rugged individual has to rise up because everything else has been taken away from them. So from a rising of stakes standpoint, how does Hopepunk handle that? If with the community coming together, what obstacles could an adventurer potentially face in a Hopepunk setting?
Yeah. The perfect example might be the first adventure, which is Salted Legacy. And it is about two families in conflict with each other. And this is, the stakes are high is because not simply that these two families are in conflict with each other, but the community as a whole is being disrupted and damaged by the conflict between these two families. And so I think a challenge would be the erosion of a community, the destruction of a community, the harm that comes to community. Those are pretty high stakes when you have maybe an otherwise a well-functioning community. Another one might be about, I would say, the Nightsea's Succor, which is a high-level adventure, and it really is a reckoning of a community and the harm and damage that happened to that community in the past. how a new community. This is actually one of the most interesting. I wouldn't say most interesting adventures, but it is a unique adventure in the book in that it takes place in two separate locations. So most of the adventures have one new location introduced. This one actually has two new locations introduced. And what is going on with that one is there's something terrible happened in the past for this community. And out of that, a new community was born, but the original community is still there. And these two communities are in communication and struggle with each other. There's challenges between the two communities and communication. But there's a reckoning going on, and it is really about these two communities reckoning with their past and trying to figure out what happens there. And I think those are two good examples of it. But even like, you know, I'm trying to think of another example. There, several of the adventures really talk about communities that, like, you know, Fiend of Hollow Mine. Part of that is maybe the story of like a community that is, you know, doing well on one level, but there is corruption, and there is like on another level, you know, there's haves and have-nots in that community, and it is that struggle between trying to find ways to maybe reckon with some things that happened badly in the past in this community, and fix that. But particularly around power, and power, like in, you know, lack of like equality in that power structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. So from a design standpoint, you designed one of the domains of Dread for Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. So when you're approaching a setting like the Radiant Citadel versus a much darker, and like your setting in particular had a lot of like political intrigue and infighting, and, you know, a lack of community. Everybody was constantly at each other. So from a design and writing standpoint, how different is that from you coming at that from such different places?
Yeah. It is significantly different on some level, but they're both conversations around communities, but just from very different angles, right? Mm-hmm. With Calicari, you know, I thought about the existential threats of like our community today. Like in America, you know, I think there are cults of personality running amok, and I think those cults of personality are threatening to overturn our democracy. I think they are threatening to what is the common good of the people, and the desire of the communal will of our country is being overridden by single individuals. Calicari is really about that too, right? A single individuals there are saying that like their privacy and need is more important than maybe the will of the people or the benefit of the people, and they're literally destroying their entire society and their entire kingdom for that. And that is really the story of that. And it's a family drama too. But those are kind of the themes there. Yeah. But there are no good guys in Calicari. And I've seen some like threads about how Ramia is, you know, well, she seems the best of the lot, and how does she become the Dark Lord? I actually, there's, you know, I could go into a whole bit about that and how I think that's mistaking the understanding, the questions of like, people who think they're doing good but do incredible evil or destruction. That needs to be investigated more, because there are very few really cackling villains out there. But it's still a monarchy, right? And it's not the people's will. It is like three people who want incredible power and were born into privilege and only care about themselves. The Radiant Citadel is governed by a mostly democratic state. There is the you know, the Council of Ancestors, and they are really about, you know, they were voted into power by the people of the Radiant Citadel, and then affirmed into power or sort of questioned by the Dawn Incarnates who want to make sure that they're really representative of the people, but the culture and the history of the land. So they have to go through two vetting processes to get onto this leadership position. And it's still a democratic, you know, primarily a democratic, this weird kind of a hybrid of democracy, but still primarily democratic. And they know their role and responsibility is to serve the Radiant Citadel. And if they aren't, they potentially could be removed from power by the Dawn Incarnates. And so those are. I came at it structurally, asking very different questions, right?
Okay.
The fundamental question with the Domain of Dread of Calicari is the ego of the individual, and the desires and egos of the individual. And then the fundamental question of Radiant Citadel is, what is the community's needs, and how does a community that is pretty complex and pretty heterogeneous, have very diverse set of peoples. There's so many different like cultures and people living in there. How do they come together and find solutions together, and how do they work together?
Okay, very interesting, very cool. So you did an interview, or there was an article surrounding journeys through the Radiant Citadel in Dragon Magazine, where you kind of went into a bit more detail about the adventure as a whole. And you spoke about there being 27 different cultures that founded the Radiant Citadel. And we have 15 remaining, and then 13 are highlighted in the adventures, with the other 2 having an epilogue where players or DMs could potentially build off of that. But you then spoke about having all the adventures written and sitting with those and allowing them to sit with you for a while before going on to then design and create the Citadel itself. And so I would love to just hear you speak about that process of going from 27 to 15, and then how you took those adventures and built out from there to create the hub.
Sure. I knew there needed to be a hub. I wanted, for multiple reasons, I wanted the adventures to, we needed to accomplish multiple complex challenges with this book. We wanted the adventures and the locations to be standalones that could be thrown into any campaign. You could just pick like one piece and pull it into your campaign. Right. But also we wanted them to theoretically, you'd be able to play the entire book from beginning to end, and that to be very fulfilling, and to create a campaign out of that as well if you wanted that. And those are 2 very different design challenges, and to try to like thread that needle is complex. And so that was my challenge, is like, how do I put these 2 pieces together? Among my solutions were to ensure all the writers had a very communal experience, kind of like the book itself is like everybody had a communal experience. So everybody got to see their pitches, each other's pitches. They got to see early drafts. They had a mandatory peer review period where they're reading each other's works and commenting it. And that will allow them to pull inspiration from each other and weave that inspiration to different places. And I think readers with a careful eye will see lots of places with that. Shared mythology in a couple of sections, shared languages in a couple of sections, and so on. And definitely some other references here and there. That was sort of my process too, is that like, I am reading this and I'm thinking about this and I'm trying to figure out, how does this all come together? And then I realized what made the most sense was that these cultures were their own cultures at one point, and then came together to build something, that allowed them to communicate better and work together better. And there's a Legends and Lore section for the Radiant Citadel that implies what the history is or hypothesizes about the history. It's pretty clear that the history of the Radiant Citadel comes after the original cultures, and that these cultures came together for some joint purpose, maybe diplomacy. There's some conversation that maybe it was about a war that they had to face. There's also some thoughts about maybe this was an arc of some sort, and that it did not originate. It clearly, I mean, for many reasons, it clearly did not originate in the deep ethereal plane. You've got this fossilized creature that was carved out of, that they carved a city out of it, and then it surrounded this giant diamond, the Auroral Diamond, and like, it's not something that's native to the deep ethereal plane. And so then there's questions like, well, how did it get there? Can it move? And that there's some implications that can move, because much like the Concord jewels can move between planes, maybe it can too, right? But so far they haven't been able to do that. There's a lot of mystery around it. And so the part of the idea that there's missing civilizations adds to that mystery. And it also adds to the potential future of the Radiant Citadel for two different directions. One was, hey, DMs, like let's say you're in Eberron or let's say you're in Kryn, you're doing an adventure there and you want to start using this book. How do you do that? Well, the easiest is there's a missing Concord jewel that was part of that original 27, and it's buried in this location, and that means that civilization was one of the original founding civilizations of the Radiant Citadel, and the players can hop into the Concord jewel, figure out the controls and figure out how to activate it, and then they're transported immediately into the Radiant Citadel, and from there they can move on to other adventures, right? And so that allows for some planar hopping and some world hopping there, right? And that was the first part. But the second part is for DMs with some radical imagination and really want to play with this idea of the full power of the Radiant Citadel is not activated until all 27 cultures are there. You could have a multi-year spanning campaign that really talks about them trying to find the missing civilizations, assimilating them all 27 are activated, and then what happens. And I give some hints about what does happen if you can get all 27, and there's some pretty world-changing opportunities with that storyline. So there's some really exciting stuff. So I embedded it and thought about it from there. But going back to the process, I'm reading these cultures and they're seeping through in every piece of my writing with the Radiant Citadel. And I make references in the city to the various different cultures in various different ways, including criminal punishment. I take it from one of I took the criminal punishment of that the Radiant Citadel uses from the worst offenders from one of the criminal punishments from that one of the locations use. Awesome. And that is natural, right? They're the Radiant Citadel leadership is hey, you practice this here. This is actually a good idea. Let's use it here as well. Foods. I even go into how these foods influence each other and that they're fusion cuisine because of it, right? So this was really deeply, I'm gestating and thinking about this, and I realized this only afterwards. I was born in New York City and lived most of my life in the New York City area. The Radiant Citadel in many ways is sort of a fantasy analogy of New York City, and the Auroral Diamond in many ways is sort of Statue of Liberty, right? Yeah. You can see the light of the Auroral Diamond throughout the ethereal plane, especially when you're in need and you're looking for it. Its light, shines, and you can follow that light back to the Radiant Citadel. And I didn't realize this until afterwards. I was oh, my brain was subconsciously working at this, and it come together.
That's great. No, that's phenomenal. I love that. So the Shield Bearers are an organization you talk about in that article as being the organization for people that want to be heroes and want to help people and rescue and help people that are without hope in the Radiant Citadel. And we had touched on the stakes of some of the adventures and things like that. How necessary are the Shield Bearers and how active are they, and how bleak do things potentially get in the Radiant Citadel for people that need their help?
Yeah. So in the Radiant Citadel itself, the Shield Bearers are probably very rarely employed because there are not generally speaking, there's not these existential crises. What the Radiant Citadel, the Shield Bearers are deployed in foreign lands, or primarily they're employed in the 15 locations that are linked to the Radiant Citadel that are in need. Because the Radiant Citadel is quasi-utopian. But it's not perfect. But it's not necessarily you're going to deploy the Shield Bearers. The Shield Bearers are usually they are dropped. So I had a lot of thought process around the Shield Bearers, and it was my thinking around American interventionism and the pros and cons of that. And it's a question around that, right? And so in some ways they're a little like fantasy Navy SEALs, or fantasy Delta Force, right? They're dropped into the most treacherous and most dangerous situations, both natural disasters, magical disasters, or just threats by invading armies or monsters or whatever. And their mission is to not stop those things for many reasons. And the Radiant Citadel government is grappling with interventionism and saying, can we do these things? What does it mean if we do these things? And I think this is where the book or this section is asking questions that D&D often doesn't ask, right? D&D is just like, the heroes are unleashed, go do your thing, right? You have no boundaries about what you can do. And that can make for fun role play, but we have had tons of that kind of role play, so that, like, me doing another version of that does not add anything new to the history of D&D. In many ways, my putting constraints puts players in some really interesting situation and asking some really interesting questions, and the DM some really interesting questions, right? The shield bearer units are not allowed to intervene in conflicts. They can only defend themselves if attacked. But their primary responsibility is to pull out civilians, those in innocents, out of conflict zones and try to take them back to the Radiant Citadel aboard a Concord Jewel.
Okay,
but that makes for some really complex and tricky situations where D&D can get messy very quickly, and so you could see. Even a hot-tempered player just being like, I'm going to throw a fireball. We're being overwhelmed. The situation's overwhelmed. All these innocents, all these civilians are going to die. I'm going to throw a fireball and kind of, protect them. And it's like, great, you just did that. Now you violated the code of the shield bearers. There might be some repercussions with the government. But there's also maybe like, oh, this started a new larger conflict. Yeah. You just wiped out. Great, you wiped out this like opposing unit. And this was a small incursion, and now they're really angry, and now it's a larger incursion. Or maybe now that this incursion is going to be like, hey, the Radiant Citadel is on the aggressive side, and now we're going to like counterattack the Radiant Citadel itself, right?
Yeah.
And these are questions that are not usually brought up in D&D, and this is why this book is radically, unique for D&D. I think it adds so much texture, subtlety, some pretty complex and interesting questions, and I think it's just incredible toolbox for DMs who want to tell more adult stories. And when I say adult stories, not just like, oh, well, let's go darker, let's get more graphic. It's actually no, we treat you as like adults who are intelligent enough to ask some really smart questions about how these adventures play out. And I think there's a lot of fun for like smart, mature players who want to ask those questions.
That's great. I love that. I had a fellow YouTuber on not too long ago, and we just talked about Cold War conflicts in D&D. And this is very evocative to me of like, you can do these things, but you can't do these things because the dominoes might start falling. And if the players act brashly, does the Radiant Citadel have to be harsher on them in order to placate somebody that wants retaliation? That's a very, I love that. I love that concept.
They're very complicated questions.
Yeah.
I remember one of my peer reviewers of that section was like, it's like, hey, Ajit, like, D&D is real messy. Like, if you put these constraints, like, how's that going to work? And I was like, that's where the story is.
Yeah.
That's where the questions are. Like, I don't want to make it less challenging for players or less messy for players. I actually like, this is where like all the juicy stuff happens, is where players are put into these really tough predicaments, because they can solve things with a fireball, or they just like, they can just roll in there and wipe out the enemy unit. And like, there's no questions around that. Like the story ends. Like you finish the story, and that is the end of the story, and the civilians are saved. Mm-hmm. In this way, the stories like can go 5 steps further, right? There's so many more branching paths that the story can take.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, from a player standpoint, you're weighing, like, if you know the consequences, then it's like, I could throw this fireball, and I'm informed in knowing, is saving the civilians right now quickly and efficiently worth me potentially taking one on the chin? I love that as both a player and a DM, that dynamic. So I'm very
and to dive into this just for 2 more seconds, that this isn't an uncontroversial position. It's like the leadership, the ruling council of which is the speakers of the ancestors, like that's their position, and that's where their position is currently. That may not mean that they don't change their mind tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I also have in text that like the leader of the shield bearers is not thrilled with this position, and is not happy with this position, and feels like they could do more if their hands were not tied in this way, and that they've seen a lot of their shield bearer comrades die in the field, probably because of this position, right? Like the shield bearers have to wait until they're attacked before they can attack first, which puts you in a huge disadvantage, right? Yeah. You're really in a bad place where you can't launch an ambush, or you can't stage the attack first. Mm-hmm. so I don't make this easy. I make this very nuanced and complex, and I think there's a lot of interesting questions and great role play that comes out of this.
I love that. Well, I have one final question for you, and it's really when players and DMs finally get the book in their hands this upcoming July and get a chance to play through it and play some of the adventures or just play the whole thing as a campaign. What do you hope from a design standpoint and a writing standpoint, what do you hope that they walk away with at the conclusion of the journeys through the Radiant Citadel as players and DMs and just as people?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And I've got probably a couple of answers.
Yeah.
One, all of the locations, including mine, were written by people of color, and they're all speaking to their own cultural backgrounds and their own personal stories. And me as an immigrant kid, I'm probably in some ways speaking about New York City from my perspective. Mm-hmm. I think the first one is it's sort of us inviting you to our homes. Mm-hmm. You're getting a kind of an inside tour. Like it's like sort of like a local taking you around Paris as opposed to you just like hopping into like a fancy hotel and being like, I'm just gonna just drive around in a taxi and hope I find something cool. Mm-hmm. No, you're kind of getting a tour of the local culture, the local city, the local community by an insider, and we hope you get that. I hope that you get that and that you feel invited into our cultures and our communities through a fantasy lens, through an easy way of role playing it through. But that's why we're using adventures instead of just being like, hey, here's an overview of the culture and here's an overview of the location, but there's nothing to tie you in there. The stories, the adventures that take you through it will get you more into that culture. And so that's the first part. I think I hope they get it. The second probably is, I hope it makes them rethink fantasy. I'm a huge Tolkien fan, and Tolkien has cast a long shadow on my life and my thought about fantasy. But also, I think it's cast a long shadow, and maybe the material that came out after Tolkien that was influenced by Tolkien is very Western European influenced, or North American influenced, and I think that is how we almost think that's all that fantasy can offer, right? There's this like limited lens that we kind of think about fantasy. And I hope this book widens that lens and says fantasy can be this and fantasy can be that too. And fantasy can be a lot more than what you think it can be. Mm-hmm. And I hope it blows up people's imaginations and they're excited by all of these new possibilities this book opens up for them. And maybe the final one is that I hope people can see interesting ways of looking at conflict and challenges that are not simply war or conquest. A reoccurring theme that a lot of us talked about, and I had some vision guidelines in the construction of the book that I laid out to make sure that the writers were in alignment with each other and in alignment with my vision for the book. But one of the recurring themes that we kind of talk about is conflict without conquest. Okay. None of the adventures in this book are about conquering another people or taking over another people or annihilating the local group so that you can capture this dungeon. Mm-hmm. It's not. But that does not mean there is an absence of conflict. There is a hell of a lot of conflict in this book. Some pretty juicy, complex, ferocious conflict that can get pretty dark and pretty dangerous fast. But I think the recurring theme of, conflict without conquest is something I hope players get out of it and DMs get out of it. Yeah. And I hope it makes them rethink the kind of stories that they take, that they make themselves and that they tell down the road.
Awesome. I love it. I was excited for the book. And then after having talked to you, I'm now pained at how long we still have to wait for the book.
You and me both. I'm like, I want this book in my hands. I want people to get it. I want players to be inspired by it, make their new characters in these locations. I want DMs to be like, oh my God, I can throw these locations and these ventures into my campaign. I just want to hear all the stories that people have when they get this book.
No, I'm very excited. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. If you want to plug where the people can find you, if they want to follow you, I follow you on Twitter. Great Twitter follow. Please go follow them.
Thank you. You can find me. Twitter's probably the place where I'm most active on social media. And my Twitter handle is Ajit George SB. Ajit George SB. Is the AJITGEORGESB.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel comes out July 19th. And I know that we all can't wait to get our hands on it. And congratulations
so much,
on the book. And thank you.
Thank you, Eric. This was a pleasure. It was wonderful talking to you.
Great talking to you too. Bye, everyone.